welcome to the Weekly Rushes, your rushed rush through all the weekly movie and streaming news. I'm going to try not to do that so much because apparently it's annoying some people. So apologies, I do rock backwards and forwards. I think it's because I feel energized, I feel enthusiastic, I like to emphasize certain points, I like depth of focus, which is a part of filmmaking, which is just wonderful, but I will try and keep it to a minimum. So, if you've been on the Popcorn Junkies Instagram account, it won't come as any surprise that Madonna's biopic has bitten the dust. I kind of felt this was going to happen when I went online, fell down a Madonna sort of wormhole on her Instagram account and saw that she was, photos of her with a script. I don't know whether she'd read it. And quite quickly on the kind of carousel, the other photos were of her bottom. So I'm not entirely sure where her priorities lay there. But anyway, it's official now it's official, but Universal haven't said anything. They haven't even commented on it. So you could ask the question, was it ever a project in the first place? But the Madonna biopic is no more. This comes after Madonna announcing that she's doing a 35-city global tour, which is quite a commitment at the grand old age. Is she 60 or 61? Obviously, she was going to direct the biopic, co-write the biopic, and history has shown that usually if you make a film, not that it's happened that often, but if you were to make a film about yourself, the jury's out as to how searingly honest it's going to be. Of course, there was a lot of chatter, though again, I don't know if this was officially announced, that Julia Garner, she of Ozark, multi-Emmy winning actress of Ozark, was apparently the front runner after quite a rigorous auditioning process. So I'm going to put my neck on the line and say I don't think it's a massive loss to cinema that this project isn't happening. Now, Marilyn Manson, traditionally and theoretically should sit within a sort of Weekly Rushes for music, but he kind of pops up for me because, of course, he's currently fighting accusations from Rachel Evan Wood, she of Westworld, most notably. Obviously, she starred in other things. So, she's got a lawsuit against him claiming sort of battery, controlling behavior, coercive control, sexual assault, indoctrination, grooming, all that kind of stuff. But he was also defending against another case, which had come from Game of Thrones actress Esme Bianco. She's dropped the case. They've come to an agreement. The original accusation from Esme Bianco was that Manson had used fraudulent offers of movie and music video appearances and roles and what have you. Classic kind of, Hollywood couch type situation. Miss Bianco was encouraged to travel to Los Angeles, where Marilyn Manson, made threats of force and performed violent sexual acts against her. By all accounts, her legal team said that Miss Bianco has agreed to resolve her claims against Brian Warner, and she wants to move on with her life and career. I'm kind of reading between the lines there that potentially Marilyn Manson has settled out of court. It's always curious, isn't it, when someone settles out of court, because everyone knows that potentially you had something to hide. I mean, I know it doesn't literally mean that, nor legally mean that, but, would you really pay for something to go away if you really felt that you could win the case? I don't know, maybe it ends up costing less than it would going to court. You may remember a couple of weeks ago we talked about the co-creator of Rick and Morty, Justin Roiland, who is also facing charges of domestic battery and false imprisonment, which are pretty big accusations. He's the co-creator of Rick and Morty. He also provides certainly the voices of the scientist character. That I'm not au fait with the series. I think he might supply the voices for both characters. The network Adult Swim, which is the network that commissioned the Rick and Morty series, has said that they will no longer be working with Justin Roiland. So essentially he's off the project, even though he's the co-creator. The series Rick and Morty is going to carry on. I mean, I was positing the idea that this must mean the end of Rick and Morty. But no, the crew and the creative team are going to be working on season 7, say the network that carries it. The co-creator Dan Harmon, who was also behind the series Community, will continue as the showrunner. And of course, we discussed a couple of weeks ago, he too has been embroiled in all sorts of accusations of bullying, potential sort of sexual kind of, creepiness, and also publishing a very sort of tasteless video of him raping a doll or something. So again, it might be in his hands, but I'm not entirely sure if the series is in quite capable hands. Now, one of the big stories this week, obviously the Oscars have been announced, and the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences has said that it's going to conduct a review of campaign procedures. Now, it's little known to people that when you're sort of shortlisted or longlisted for the Oscars, should we have gone out and represented our short film? a huge PR machine is generated behind all the films. You know, the films are pushed out to various members of the Academy. There's nearly 10,000 voting members. Screenings are created. There'll be a knowledge amongst the sort of higher echelons, A-listers of Hollywood and Los Angeles as to who those voters are. So there's a lot of luring. You could argue it's bribing. You could argue it's massaging, but in the sort of most permitted sense of the term, it's campaigning for your film. But I don't know if you remember, Andrea Riseborough won a Best Actress nomination. And ever since she's been nominated, there's been a huge hoo-ha about whether the campaigning procedures for films that are nominated in the Oscars is okay. Now, this kind of splits off in two different directions and then into a third direction. The Academy has said that it's conducting a review of the campaign procedures around this year's nominees. They're mulling whether changes to the guidelines may be needed in a new era of social media and digital communication. Now, everyone's kind of, joined the dots and thought, well, the biggest surprise in all the nominations was Andrea Riseborough. At least of all, it was most surprising for her. She said, "I'm astounded. It was so hard to believe it might ever happen because we really hadn't been in the running for anything else," which in and of itself is curious that it wasn't sort of hitting all of the kind of awards ceremonies. Even though we had a lot of support, the idea it might actually happen seemed so far away. To add to this, screenings were organised by incredibly influential characters like Charlize Theron, Gwyneth Paltrow, Courtney Cox, Ed Norton, Jennifer Aniston, you name it, Minnie Driver. So there was a lot of kind of support behind this. Now, some people are saying, this is classic Academy Awards. Unless you've pumped lots of effort, a huge campaign behind what they deem to be Oscar-worthy films, it's fine. Whereas if something creeps through that perhaps wasn't expected and is a bit of a kind of sideways kind of shock, then suddenly it all has to be investigated and all the rest of it. I personally think they wouldn't be looking into this unless they think something has gone awry. So that's one thing. The other aspect of this, and I feel for Andrea Riseborough in this, because she's kind of caught in the middle in a sense. She's got her nomination and it's being tainted from the get-go. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if she actually ends up saying, do you know what, take your nomination and stuff it. Because it's developing and evolving into a race row around the fact that, and I think there's, again, a lot of merit to this argument, Andrea Riseborough being shortlisted above the actors that appeared in The Woman King, Viola Davis, and Till, which was performed by Danielle Deadwyler. They didn't get a look in, and obviously in this age of diversity, representation amongst both the kind of voting for the Oscars and the nominations for the Oscars, a few eyebrows have been nudged upwards by the fact that Andrea Riseborough cut through, but neither of these black actresses cut through who were in extremely high profile and in some regards successful films. It's got so bad that in fact on social media an old hashtag that was once being used, Oscars So White, has re-emerged on Twitter. So in a sense, through no fault of her own, Andrea Riseborough finds herself at the heart of this really quite sort of unfortunate kind of debate and kind of controversy in a sense, of which the dust has been kicked up by the Academy and the suggestion that perhaps she didn't get her nomination in a valid or fair fashion. So that's one thing. And now it's turning towards people quite, understandably saying, well, hang on a minute, where is the black representation here when we've had some stellar performances by black actresses? So on the one hand, I can see the argument behind those supporting the lack of representation in the nominations. I also feel for Andrea Riseborough, and I do kind of think that the Academy would only announce this if they genuinely felt there was something that needed to be investigated. What are your thoughts? We announced last week, or we talked about last week, the fact that the Michael Jackson biopic, simply called Michael, is being made, directed by Antoine Fuqua, and they've announced who's going to play Michael Jackson, and this is a curious detail. Jafar Jackson, who is the real-life nephew of Michael Jackson, and is 26 years old, he is going to play Michael Jackson. Jafar Jackson is the son of Jermaine Jackson, who obviously was Michael Jackson's brother. Jafar himself, a bit like Michael Jackson, has been singing and performing since the age of 12, so he's a good fit for the role. But it's going to be a curious one. He might sort of find himself kind of going towards parts of Michael Jackson's story that perhaps, the family themselves have potentially kind of circumnavigated and avoided for many years. So, I mean, the film is promising to explore the accusations of paedophilia, the plastic surgery, his various marriages, the curious circumstances in which he died from an overdose, cardiac arrest due to an overdose of medication. The Michael Jackson estate are in cahoots with this production. Obviously, as with all these biopics, you need the music library to give it heft and to give it sort of qualification. But in a sense, this is the kind of Faustian pact. Unless the producers and makers of this film dig deep into some of the controversy, you know, people will smell a rat, and I don't think people will come to it. Part of me almost kind of feels that's what happened with the recent Whitney Houston biopic. You know, there was a huge sort of hoo-ha about it coming out, and then when it was released, it just was a damp squib, and it didn't do particularly well. So I wonder whether the tide is turning a bit on these biopics. So Michael Jackson, or Michael the biopic, might be one of those that needs to turn in a different direction and get searingly honest about the life of the artist they're profiling. On Coffee Moaning last week, we talked about the Razzies, those awards for awful performances, awful films, and all the rest of it. It's meant to be fun, it's meant to be funny, but actually I imagine for those people who are nominated, it really hurts. And one particular person who was nominated, and this caused a little bit of controversy, well, quite a lot actually, was 12-year-old actress Ryan Kiera Armstrong, and she was starring in a remake, essentially, or a reboot of Firestarter. Well, not surprisingly, the original Firestarter from the original film, Drew Barrymore, she was in the film in 1984, obviously after the success of E.T. Drew Barrymore's came out and said her blood boiled when she saw that the other young actress had been nominated. She described it as bullying. Listen, I get poking fun at ourselves, she said. I mean, come on, fair game, bring it on. But Ryan is 12 years old. That said, though, the Razzie co-founder and kind of organiser of the awards has kind of since apologised, and they have actually removed the young actress Ryan Kiera Armstrong from the nominations and have agreed not to include in future anyone under the 18. I mean, that seems kind of obvious enough. Otherwise, it's a form of kind of sanctioned trolling, isn't it? I mean, we've heard a lot about Bella Ramsey in The Last of Us, you know, really questioning whether she was doing the right thing being in the series due to a lot of the kind of negative attention she was getting on social media. So to have a sort of sanctioned and kind of, you know, something that people are fond of and not considered to be vicious nomination for a 12-year-old could really impact on and affect that young actress's career for many years to come. So on to some of the new projects, directorial decisions, casting decisions, new films, new streaming series and all that sort of stuff. Jason Bateman. I haven't talked about my man crushes in recent years just because I felt it was getting too much and the list was getting too long. But if I had to pop someone at the top, Jason Bateman is there. Obviously, Jason Bateman, recently the star of Ozark, huge success. And what's not particularly known by many people is he directed quite a few episodes of Ozark. And whenever he did direct, you felt you were in extraordinarily capable hands. He's got very visual sensibility. Well, Jason Bateman is set to direct a project for Warner Brothers and for J.J. Abrams' company Bad Robot called The Pinkertons, or The Pinkerton. And this sounds quite interesting. It's described as a supernatural Western revenge drama. Christ almighty, there's a hell of a lot of many genres all kind of clustered into one. Apparently, the Pinkertons were a secret security service that was started in 1850, and they claimed to have kind of foiled an assassination attempt on Abraham Lincoln. And because they convinced Lincoln that that's what they did, they then essentially became President Abraham Lincoln's kind of hired security team to look after him. Obviously didn't succeed in the end, did they? Bateman will be directing this. It's not his first film. His other films that he's directed were The Family Fang, which I haven't seen, and Bad Words. Not entirely sure whether either of those were good. But I think this sounds intriguing. I'm not entirely convinced as to what the supernatural aspect of it will be. But I think I never heard of this concept of the Pinkerton. So, you know, again, I love these stories that throw a spotlight, a little bit like Emancipation, that throw a spotlight on a little-known aspect of American history. We talked a lot on this channel, on the Popcorn Junkies, about how brilliant Barbarian was as a horror film. Very, you know, not very low budget, but low budget enough. It made a fabulous return. I think 5 times its budget. I think it made for 10 million, made 50 million. Barbarian director Zach Kreiger has obviously become a hot ticket. He's a sort of, they want to sign him up. He wants to kind of do good stuff. He's had a huge hit. Lots of people love it. It's been critically applauded and it's been box office applauded too. His follow-up film is going to be something called Weapons. Not an awful lot is known about the project, but apparently they're saying that tonally it's in the vein of the film Magnolia. And quite a few studios are trying to nab this project, and Zach Kreiger has gone for it because actually now he can get final cut on the film, which is something that directors often look for and don't often get, which is their vision is the vision. And I think when you've dealt with a project of such a low budget, this might be his only time, because as soon as you get awarded final cut, of course, if it doesn't work, the buck stops with you. So it's a poison chalice sometimes, but if it works, suddenly we're looking at an auteur who's going to be able to call the shots in Hollywood. Another director who's incredibly interesting is Robert Eggers. He did The Witch, he did The Lighthouse, he also did recently The Northman, and as I've said before, he's doing a sort of, I don't even know if it's necessarily modern, but he's doing a re-rendering of Nosferatu, the classic, vampire story, you know, the original one with the great sort of vampire with long fingers and long teeth, well, not long teeth, but bald, and he'd be in the shadows, and he always creeped me out more than any other vampire when I was a kid. Whenever I saw photos of him, I was like, oh my God. This film, called Nosferatu, has a really good cast. Lily Rose Depp, Johnny Depp's daughter's in there. Bill Skarsgård is in there, also from The Barbarian and It. And Nicholas Hoult, recently seen in The Menu. Fabulous cast, those three, absolutely brilliant. But who's joining the cast? Willem Dafoe. And the weird thing about this is Willem Dafoe played Nosferatu many years ago in something called The Shadow of the Vampire. So could Willem Dafoe be playing Nosferatu in this? That might be quite an interesting meta thing. Obviously, Willem Dafoe was in Eggers' The Lighthouse. Adding him is a brilliant ingredient. I mean, Willem Dafoe, whatever you think of him, always adds another aspect to a film. A little bit like Christopher Walken, a little bit like Nick Cage. Curious, odd, off-ball. You never quite know what you're going to get from them. Obviously, Nosferatu is a gothic tale about a haunted young woman, and it's set in 19th century Germany, and the Transylvanian vampire who stalks her brings untold horror. What not to like? I mean, you know, Eggers back in his horror territory, though even in The Lighthouse, horror was laced through it. He's a great atmosphere builder. So, you know, could he have a fourth hit? The Northman was good. It was quite cumbersome. It was quite a big thing to swallow. I mean, quite literally. But it was interesting. I mean, he's a fascinating filmmaker, and he's an incredibly cinematic filmmaker too. So over to streaming stories. Nicole Kidman. I mean, Nicole Kidman goes from strength to strength, and she's obviously the darling of HBO at the moment. She's back with another limited series. Obviously, she was in the series Big Little Lies, and I think she was one of the co-producers on that, and she's in a new series called, or limited series, short series called The Perfect Nanny. This limited series is based on a book by Leila Slimani. It's based on the story of the Krim children of 2012, and these were two children, a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old, who were murdered in New York City. This pivots around a perfect nanny, a woman who's employed to work for a couple with their 2 children, and as I say, it's based on a true story. But the personality of this kind of nanny starts to deteriorate, and I suppose, obviously, the suggestion is that was she responsible for the murder of these children? Was she responsible for leaving them vulnerable? I'm getting from this a sort of The Servant vibes, which is an Apple TV series by M. Night Shyamalan. And I'm curious to know how this will work. Nicole Kidman is exec producer on this too. Always going back to that thing, Nicole Kidman, 9 Perfect Strangers, I felt it was another Nicole Kidman role. She was particularly good in the recent Being the Ricardos. She was excellent. She was absolutely excellent in that. So let's hope that this could be a continuation of her return to form, because I felt she was falling foul of the thing that, don't say it, I feel Kate Blanchett's falling foul of, which is every role is Kate Blanchett playing a role. And unfortunately, I felt Nicole Kidman's going the same way. But maybe this will be different. New project, The Perfect Nanny at HBO. The Last of Us, not much to say here other than, wow, what a series. Obviously, it's getting plaudits both from the critics. Its viewing numbers are sensational and brilliant. Pedro Pascal in there. I'm going to watch episode 3 very soon and review it. It appeals to young and old. It's one of those rare things that takes a sort of, they call them computer game, is it a console game? And translates it into something quite nuanced and sophisticated, and I feel head and shoulders above something like Walking Dead. Obviously, as someone said last week, Walking Dead was made many years ago, and it's not a fair comparison necessarily. Well, The Last of Us, unsurprisingly, has been renewed for season 2 already, based upon its stellar success. And I think in many regards, I think HBO's on a win here. The House of the Dragon, I thought, was excellent. I thought it laid a really sophisticated and complex sort of foundations for the exploration of new series, new characters, new conflicts. And I think The Last of Us is doing the same thing. Obviously, there are 2 games. There's The Last of Us, and then there's The Last of Us Part 2. So there's plenty of territory for this to exploit. And because it's expanding upon the game, again, how far could this go? So The Last of Us is coming back for season 2. Also on the Popcorn Junkies Instagram account, we flagged up the fact that Phoebe Waller-Bridge, the woman behind Killing Eve, Fleabag, she's got a new series getting away at Amazon, Amazon Studios. And this is a Phoebe Waller-Bridge produced series. Not entirely sure if she's writing it, but this pivots around Tomb Raider. And I don't know if you remember, Alicia Vikander relaunched Tomb Raider with a movie that was all right. There was talk of a second movie happening with Alicia Vikander. Obviously, originally, Angelina Jolie launched herself, really, and the whole Lara Croft thing on the world. And it was quite a success, the first film with Angelina Jolie. The plan with this is to turn it into a series. And I think Amazon are trying to hoover up, if you like, the empire of Tomb Raider, like they have, well, not all of, but part of the J.R.R. Tolkien Lord of the Rings kind of territory. I personally don't think I don't think this is going to do well. I mean, I really don't. I think Tomb Raider had its moment. I think the films suggest it had its moment. And I just wonder whether this is because Amazon have bought the property, the IP, intellectual property, that they've got to go ahead with it. Maybe Phoebe Waller-Bridge can bring some sort of meta kind of humour to it, feminist kind of narrative. I don't know. Obviously, Phoebe Waller-Bridge is soon to be seen in Indiana Jones 5. And as I said on the Popcorn Junkies, perhaps she's just been smitten with the archaeological bug, because there's kind of crossover there too. Okay, so recently, I don't know if you saw it, there was a movie called Ticket to Paradise starring Julia Roberts and George Clooney. It kind of passed us by. It wasn't my kind of cup of tea. The trailer was kind of fun. I kind of like George Clooney. When he's funny, he can be really funny, self-deprecating and all of that. Julia Roberts, I have a huge crush on. Always have, always will. But not necessarily overly sort of impressed with the films that she's in. Well, Amazon Studios have been competing for an enormous project, fought off lots of other kind of competition, to win over a project called, just simply working title, Body Swap Comedy. This is going to be directed, and it's not entirely dissimilar, by the guy Max Barbacow, who directed Palm Springs, which, if you haven't seen, that's Andy Samberg and Christine Milioti. She's fantastic, Christine Milioti. Very funny film where a couple are caught in a time loop, quite Groundhog Day. Very witty and very clever. At first I thought going through the same day is always a bit boring. I'm one of those people who wasn't a fan of Groundhog Day, actually. But this film sort of almost has something similar, body swap comedies, and it stars Jennifer Aniston and Julia Roberts, so it's got some, big chops in there. And of course, the draw of this is perhaps the opportunity to repeat what was an unexpected hit relative to its budget with Ticket to Paradise. Which brings us to films of the week. Films of the week, well, there's 3 offerings. Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. This could be a really good choice if you've got kids, if you've got family, but also one of those films that rarely, I think these days, is a film aimed at children, but also will appeal to adults. It has a fabulous voice cast. Obviously, Antonio Banderas is there as Puss in Boots. Florence Pugh is in there. Olivia Colman is in there. Salma Hayek is in there, all providing the voices. I think this pivots around the idea that Puss in Boots realises he's kind of on the edge. He's reaching the end of his 9 lives. He's used 8 of his 9 lives. By all accounts, on a clip that I've seen, there's a brilliant villain in this, and I think the villain is something a little bit like the Sonic the Hedgehog and Jim Carrey. I think the villain is the kind of guilty pleasure in this project. So Puss in Boots: The Last Wish is apparently much better than you would think with a threequel. Is it a threequel? I think there've been a couple of other Puss in Boots films before it. The other big release, critical success, is The Whale. Our review will be landing very shortly. We saw it in a preview. Obviously, this features the central performance of Brendan Fraser as a morbidly obese father who strikes up in unusual circumstances, or his relationship with his daughter after having been estranged from her for a while. Brendan Fraser is tipped to win the Oscar. I don't want to give away too much about what I thought about the film. It's a compelling film based on a play. It also stars Sadie Sink, who's the girl who was a real breakout hit, actually, in Stranger Things. She was one of my favourite actresses in that. So this is The Whale, and it really is an unflinching look at sort of self-loathing and the sort of internal struggle of a man who knows he's essentially killing himself through overeating. And finally, the last film is something called Knock at the Cabin. This is a project directed by M. Night Shyamalan. I don't know if you remember, he did Old, was it? The film where they all went on a beach and they all started to age sort of incredibly rapidly. Weird. It was a weird film. It kind of, as an idea, it worked, but then it sort of fell apart. This is my issue with M. Night Shyamalan. I think he has lots of fabulous ideas, but in the execution, they tend to unravel in a not particularly convincing fashion. This stars Dave Bautista, Rupert Grint. They sort of form part of a kind of 4-armed strangers, like a sort of militia of sorts, who come bashing into a cabin where a gay couple, 2 guys and their child or children, are on holiday. They come in and they present these 2 fathers and the family with a horrendous trade-off decision to rescue the world. The trailer doesn't suggest whether what they're saying is true or whether they're just a bunch of psychopaths, but it looks like a really sort of awful kind of Faustian decision that these parents have to make in order to potentially rescue the world. So it's called Knock at the Cabin. Again, my worry, it might be a great idea that unravels very quickly, but I'm a fan of Dave Bautista. I thought he was excellent in Glass Onion and Knives Out story, and I love him as Drax. So I might go and see this. I think it'll be quite a genre film. And there you have this week's Weekly Rushes. Your rushed rush through all the weekly movie news and streaming news. Tell me what your favourite story was. Tell me what's kind of getting you excited in the world of films and streaming. And see you next week.